Hello, I'm Jim Clark, and this is Writers Around Annapolis. I'm here this evening with my co-host, Mary Adams, co-owner of the Annapolis bookstore on Maryland Avenue, and our guest, Lailee, back to you, the author of Harem Letters and Chai, and Mending Nations, and The Roses of Isfahan, and other books. And I've been looking forward to this. I just finished reading Harem Letters, and it's an amazingly well-written book, and it's very unusual. It's epistolatory, it's a narrative, but it's a novel. It's a generational novel. How long did it take you to write this book?
That's a good question. I think for Harem Letters, I had been working under Robert Sweet at San Jose State. He was a wonderful writer who wrote a book called Writing Toward Wisdom. And of all the different mentors I had, primarily at the University of North Carolina, where I went to college and really learned the craft of writing, it was Robert Sweet's book, Writing Towards Wisdom, that directed a number of short stories that I had written. I took a short story class under him. And those short stories formed what would become the foundation of the novel Harem Letters. So I would say that it probably took a few years in all in order to write about a dozen short stories and to have them sort of be the foundation of what was going to become Harem Letters.
And how much later did you write Harem Letters? If they're the foundation, did you just put those short stories together or write a whole new book?
Oh, I had to write a whole new book because I had to choreograph. Stylistically, I was looking towards a number of multicultural writers in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is where I wrote the novel. And there were a number of multicultural authors like Amy Tan and Isabel Allende, Maxine Hong Kingston, Chitra Divakaruni, who were writing, in many cases, narratives that were multi-generational. And each one adapted a slightly different voice, of course, based on their culture. But each one, stylistically, was trying to show the strength of the character from their legacy, from their roots, from their ancestral home, and how there was a migration into the Western world. And so they had sort of the same combination of past, present, and then some younger character who looked toward the future, sort of a 21st century character amidst some 19th century characters that were, echoes of their nannies or the geisha girls of the past. So in terms of writing it, what I actually did structurally is I made a large chart. I made a genealogy chart of each mother and their child and their different, relations. And so I had to do that in order to weave the story and the theme together very carefully. So I had a separate, to start all over again. But I think the character development comes out of a lot of work.
And this is a novel. There are some male characters, and it's mostly about women.
Yes, this is definitely mostly a woman's story, which is why I called it Harem Letters. And harem, one might think initially of a harem as being something, out of the fantasy of Aladdin or Sinbad the Sailor, or at another time where it was really only lightly known on the surface. But behind the scenes of a harem was a woman who was very well educated. She had to have the art of poetry well understood. She had to understand communication between relations. So I wrote Harem Letters because it was primarily a woman's story for women's stories, and that took me to the characters a little bit more intimately and more closely. And I used the epistolary form because structurally I think that letter writing is sort of an antique form. Mm-hmm. Now we have text messaging, now we have emailing, mm-hmm. and we have telephone and cellular telephones. So we have much different ways in the 21st century of communicating, but still that letter form even if used today, you know, a special time of year to write someone a letter, there's something that happens between the brain and the hand when you're actually hand writing to someone as opposed to writing on a keyboard. And so that also offered what I wanted in harem letters, the concept. These were letters written between women of stories that they needed to remember from their roots. Because in order to reconcile their current identity, they needed to know their past. And the theme of the novel really is about cultures and mending nations, really, between cultures. And it really encourages embracing culture. And today, I think it's very important that we embrace our ancestral roots. We embrace the languages perhaps our ancestors spoke. And sometimes young people might think, well, why would I be interested in the past? And I don't mean looking in the rearview mirror and not sort of driving forward in life, but what happens is we develop a concept of our identity and our language through our roots, and imperceptibly we have a richness in our lives. We make different choices when we're more aware of where our grandmothers maybe came from, or our grandfathers. So I think the concept of legacy and cultural legacy is in the novel. Well, also because I love languages as well. You know, I speak a number of languages.
Yes, you were a French major.
Yes, I went to the University of North Carolina for 4 years, and I studied French literature. And I became very well versed in Montesquieu, who had written the Persian letters. And in the Persian letters, he depicted him, a character, as a Frenchman observing Orientalists coming to Paris. Now this is in the 18th century. So my novel also was borrowed from the concept of Montesquieu's Persian letters.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I think that French literature had a huge influence. I think that when I actually took the tour for Harem Letters, I didn't want to tour the book by myself. So I took two of my best friends, and one was a Russian woman, Luba Brezhnev, the niece of Leonid Brezhnev. Luba had written a wonderful book called The World I Left Behind, a memoir of her life in Russia. And the other friend was Miriam Chavez, and she was the daughter-in-law of the labor leader Cesar Chavez. She was married to Fernando. Cesar Chavez had 9 children. The eldest was a son, Fernando. And they married. They met at Georgetown Law School and married. So what we tried to conceive of was representing 3 different cultures, you know, sort of the Soviet Union, the Russian culture, the Cuban culture, and the Hispanic culture of the Chavez family, and the Iranian Persian culture that I was from. All 3 of us experienced sort of disenfranchisement from American relations. There was chaos, there was rebellion and revolution in our respective countries, and a lot of turmoil. And we thought that our literature, as daughters of expatriates, as daughters of revolutionaries, as daughters of people who wanted to really fight for democracy and justice, we felt that part of our personal mission was to create and write literature. This is just our personal mission. Everyone has a different path that would express how in words we can heal, we can reconcile. And we can take that, we used to call it the red zone of hatred, the red zone of fear, the red zone of the fire of anger, and convert it into a red zone of passion and love by embracing cultures. And so the concept we had as 3 separate women was that words heal. And so we used our voices and we went on tour, the 3 of us together, and it was a wonderful experience.
And how long did the tour last?
The tour lasted 3 months, and we went to the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. We spoke there, and I ended up speaking at the United Nations at an event there. And we spoke throughout Northern California at the various typical venues at universities, and we had discussions about mending the red zone, was what we called it, and through our different types of literature, bringing cultures and embracing our identities, because people are more alike.
And I think that this book really does that too. Are you a second generation in America, or are you?
I am first generation.
First
actually.
generation in
Yes.
America.
My mother is Persian, and she actually was born in Tehran with her one of seven, 5 sisters and 2 brothers. And actually her mother was American. So my mother, she was a nurse, and she and her husband in 1929 at our Great Depression, she and her husband, Dr. Bakhtiar, who had come to the United States after World War I, 1919, and 1914 and 1918 being the First World War, and he went to medical school. And he returned to be physician to the Shah of Iran's father, Reza Shah, the old Shah. And he opened the first hospitals there. But his wife, my grandmother, Helen Bakhtiar, being a nurse, she was not just a woman going to a foreign country. She had a meaningful purpose. She was inoculating people, helping them to rid the Persian Gulf area of malaria. They opened the first hospitals for women.
She delivered children.
She delivered children. She was a midwife. And of course, they had about a 90% infant mortality rate at that time. So you can imagine, like a Jane Goodall going to Africa and bringing certain knowledge about the environment, you know, and yet being very tender to keep that environment as she found it.
And one of the fascinating things about this novel, of course, that story is encapsulated in this novel. It's part of it. And of course, your family, the Persian, the Iranian side of the family came from, you know, the Zagros Mountains. They're nomads, Bakhtiari. You speak Farsi, I take it.
Yes.
Do you speak any of the other languages?
I speak, I understand some of the Luri. Luri is an ancient language that's not really written down.
Not written down.
But essentially, the Zagros Mountains, the Persian Gulf is like a wishbone. And between the Persian Gulf north towards Turkey, there's 3 sets of ancient tribes. The first are the Qashqai, the sort of the middle section of the Bakhtiari, and the most northern section, which is familiar to the world too, are the Kurds.
Yes.
And so those tribes are basically Indo-European tribes that migrated across the northern plateaus, you know, all the way sort of from China really, and they dipped down into the mountains and stayed there. So then in England, the Royal Geographic Society counts them as among, because of the indomitable mountains, and it's so inhospitable and so secluded, that those tribes have remained relatively intact for thousands of years. So I went in 2000, I camped with the nomads for a month.
I remember when you came back and sharing that experience with us. I was hoping you were going to talk about that.
And now they move the horses by truck. It's no more like it was pictured in grass. They don't.
Well, you remember that.
Yes.
Well, they used to have over 1 million tribes migrating. And the migration is essentially a vertical migration. It's about 150 miles. And so in the lower plains, when it's really hot and the summer comes, then you go to the cooler mountain pastures, because essentially you're taking the flock of sheep, and those flock of sheep provide you your predominant lifestyle, the wool. The wool that makes the tents, that makes the rugs that you sell in market, that brings, you know, a barter in the marketplace, the silk route, part of the silk route. So those sheep need water, so they go up and down, and over the centuries, through political upheaval, a particular upheaval was in 1901. That was probably the greatest alteration, because in 1901, oil was discovered in the Bakhtiar tribe lands. So when oil was discovered, the British Petroleum Company came, and the old Shah, Reza Shah, basically claimed the land, which was almost like a separate country.
And he tried to not only dislodge, but he tried to get rid of Bakhtiari, actually, didn't he?
Yes, there was a roundup, and basically they were exterminated, quite frankly. I mean, some were told to go to Afghanistan, so you have a lot of Bakhtiars in Afghanistan, basically since the turn of the century. Some escaped and took their children to Germany, to France, to England, and some America. But essentially there was a mass exodus because they were being killed.
And did that go on over a number of years?
Well, yes. My mother's relative, Shapur Bakhtiar, was the former prime minister of Iran. And of course he was assassinated in Paris. But he was, at the time of the 1979 revolution, he was the interim president of the country and prime minister when the Shah left. So throughout the century, the Bakhtiar have been proponents of democracy. And essentially, the Bakhtiar tribal lands, sort of the southwest of Persia, had their own standing cavalry. It was really throughout 5,000 years, it was its own province, if you will.
And in this novel, we have Dara, who's the dervish soothsayer says he will call her knowledge. And she comes to this country and becomes a doctor. But she admires all things that she can learn, and she considers knowledge power and such. And you know, I've known a lot of Iranian intellectuals, and most of the Iranians I've ever known are very well educated. A lot of them were educated here, but some of them were educated in other countries. And I was selling books one time at the Southeastern Book Fair in Charleston.